Good evening and welcome to the world today. We're going to discuss Turkey, which is in a critical state on many levels. First, we have a government in Turkey, led of course by President Erdogan and the AKP, which has been in power now for many years, and which, when it first came to power, was welcomed extremely enthusiastically by the United States, by Britain, by the financial press, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, as a model Islamist government and something that could be imitated in Egypt, in Tunisia. These were NATO's favorite Islamists. They could do no wrong. They were supposed to be modernizers, reformers. Of course, this was largely an illusion that this was going to be a liberal reforming government, as many thought abroad or wanted to think. And some liberals in Turkey also had hopes, which were ended very rapidly. In fact, there was never an age where Erdogan was too different from what he is now. He was cleverer, he was maneuvering in a slightly different world, and most importantly, he was a believer in neoliberal economics and all that that implied, and he was a staunch supporter of US foreign policy. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a massive outbreak of repression in Turkey. Against who? Against the usual people, starting off with the Kurdish population of that country, with religious minorities, with left-wing progressive intellectuals, with anyone who opens their mouth to question the verities, the so-called verities of the Turkish state and its long-standing demands. One of the most interesting and exciting and hopeful developments in Turkey over the last years has been the formation of the Popular Democratic Party, the HDP, which managed to create a coalition which encompassed not just the Kurdish people, but socialists, religious minorities, women, LGBT groups, an inclusive progressive party which defeated the constitutional aim of preventing dissenters from coming into parliament by putting the 10% as the minimum requirement to get into parliament. The HDP defeated that by winning 13% of the vote, and actually for the first time creating an extremely lively opposition to the regime. This panicked Erdogan, and his target has been the HDP from the day they won 13% of the vote. This sent shockwaves within the Turkish elite and the Turkish establishment. Subsequently, a fight within the AKP between Recep Erdogan and Fethullah Gulen, his longtime ally who split with him, led to a attempted military coup. A lot of provocations were carried out by the regime against the HDP, against peace demonstrations, and ultimately a section of the Kurdish movement decided to resist once again. This was then used once again to target the HDP, whose leaders are in prison, whose members of parliament are in prison, whose elected mayors are in prison, and tens of thousands of HDP activists are in prison. We're very privileged today to be joined by Hisyar Özsoy, who is the co-vice chairman of the party, and has been speaking at a conference in solidarity with those who are being repressed in Turkey today. Hisyar, welcome. You yourself, of course, are due for trial in June and could be sentenced to prison to join all your comrades there.
Yeah.
Could you give us a description of what it's like to be in Turkey today?
I mean, I can't tell this much. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity. There is no law in the country. It has been totally suspended. So whatever Erdogan decides, whatever he wishes, is the rule now. But it's not Erdogan alone. Erdogan, when in his fight against the Fethullah Gulen community, who allegedly organized the coup attempt, he made an alliance with so many ultra-nationalist sectors within the Turkish society as well as the army. So, and they have been quite aggressive against the opposition, of course, particularly the HDP, who, as you said, could stop Erdogan's presidential ambitions in June 2015. But I think the problem is bigger. The Turkish establishment in general is trying to deal with a much bigger regional crisis, whatever is happening in the Middle East since the so-called Arab Spring. One big challenge is the fact that the Kurds now do exist. The world is recognizing them out of the debris of the political systems in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Turkey. The Kurds are emerging as crucial political actors, and unfortunately, the Turkish establishment as a whole, by which I mean Erdogan and his allies, multiple allies, all of them ultra-nationalists and decisively anti-Kurdish, highly militaristic, highly racist people who came together, and they are trying to restructure the Turkish state apparatus in highly nationalist ways. And when they are doing this, anybody who has any kind of critical ideas about what they are doing, how they are reshaping Turkish society and politics, they are, of course, the target. I myself have 3 court cases, 2 arrest warrants, and I may go to prison when I go back to Turkey, actually. Many of my friends are like this. Currently, our co-chairs, 7 other deputies are already in prison. 6 of our deputies, they lost their parliamentary mandate. 14 others were sentenced, and if those sentences are approved by the Court of Appeals, they will go to prison and lose their mandate. I myself may go to prison. Anytime, anybody can go to prison because, as I said, it's kind of a state of nature, no rule of law there, and complete destruction of the separation of powers. But still, there is a very strong opposition to Erdogan, and we are optimistic that we can stop the political direction of the country in 2019.
Turkey is, of course, a staunch member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For many, many decades, it has been a pillar of NATO in that region and beyond. And yet the coverage of this repression in the Western media today, I mean, I look at many European papers and American papers regularly, it's been very muted. Of course, some papers have been critical, but compared to what these newspapers would write if Turkey was not a member of NATO or even a mildly hostile state, the coverage is pretty shocking. I mean, the scale of the repression is not talked about, and the authoritarian nature of the regime. Of course, one reason we know is that they have paid him billions to keep the refugees there. I mean, he's been paid off, and because they do these deals with him, the European Union, they refuse to be too critical. But from what you describe and what other colleagues in Turkey have described from within the media, journalists put into prison, editors locked up, professors stopped from teaching because they're not regarded as reliable and referred to as anti-state elements.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a classic authoritarian model.
Yeah, I think so. There are 2 things here. One is Erdogan is personally trying to survive. He's pretty much isolated. He's cornered, both at home and abroad. And he made alliances with so many other sectors, all of them ultra-nationalists. I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is, for example, the former chief of police, who even stayed in prison for doing illegal things, and he always brags about how many Kurds he killed during the 90s. So now he is a good ally of Erdogan. One is the leader of the nationalist party, the ultra-nationalist party. Certain sectors within the army who are quite nationalistic. So, and for these people, what is happening in Syria is an existential issue for Turkey, like the Kurds gaining an autonomous kind of status in Syria is unfortunately perceived by these Turkish elites as a national security threat.
Because they argue it encourages the Kurds
exactly.
in eastern Turkey.
Which is, I mean, 60% of the Kurds who live in the Middle East, they live within Turkey's borders. So that is the biggest Kurdish population there. Iraqi Kurds already, they have almost a confederal system there. So the Kurds in Syria are developing their own kind of administrative model. And of course there will be repercussions in Turkey, that is for sure. But how do you respond to this situation where Kurds are emerging as a regional actor? They do exist. Either you are going to kill them all, and for now it seems that what Erdogan is thinking, he would destroy, all the Kurdish towns, both in Turkey and outside, if he can. But the international and local conjuncture, the regional conjuncture, is not allowing Erdogan to do this. Or we think, and this is our proposal, rather than perceiving the Kurds as a national security threat, Erdogan can take it as an opportunity and re-engage the Kurds on friendly terms. So, which means he can have better relations with the Kurds in Syria and take them as partners. And also that may help to resume the peace process at home in Turkey, which was in effect between 2013 and 2015, which Erdogan suspended right after we entered the parliament. I do think that he is also under a lot of pressure of the certain sectors within the army and all these ultranationalist circles, because the fact is that there is not much that unites. There is not kind of a coherent ideology that unites these members of this new alliance, the Nationalist Front. The only thing that they have in common is being enemies of the Kurds. So that is why this strong dose of anti-Kurdish nationalistic discourse, both in Turkey and also in Syria.
But Hisyar, you leave one big question out of the equation, which is that whatever the situation is locally and whatever the relationship of forces, the big player on the global stage is the United States of America. So what the United States decides, for whatever reason, and their reasons change, they change allies, is quite critical. I mean, if they wanted to, normally when they don't like a country or what a country is doing which they feel is against their interests, they sanction it. They put sanctions against Iran, against Venezuela, against Russia, whatever. They're capable of doing that. Against Turkey, nothing so far, because it's a member of NATO, which is a huge contradiction for the European Union at the moment and for the United States. So how do you think the United States is going to react?
So of course the Americans, they do have their own political agenda in Syria and in Iraq, but they don't really know much about what to do with Turkey, because yes, Turkey is a member of the NATO, but they can't work with Erdogan. In fact, last year there were a couple of sanctions. For example, visa applications to the US from Turkey, they were suspended for some time, and the US very recently, they also declared Turkey to be a place, a not so good place for touristic destination. In Syria though, Americans too they don't have many options other than working with the Kurds. I mean, they can't work with Assad, they can't work with ISIS, they can't work with the former, the so-called Free Syrian army, because they worked with them and they failed, they couldn't. So now Turkey is somehow mobilizing those Free Syrian army elements, not against Assad, but against the Kurds. So the strange thing here is particularly for those who are on the left of the political spectrum. So this movement, the Kurdish movement in Syria, is left-leaning, even anarchist in certain respects, highly progressive force with women, men, and they have proved to be quite a hope-giving kind of movement in the Middle East. Ideologically, they are strongly opposed to what they call capitalistic modernity, but then practically speaking, there is an alliance with the United States. And of course, the Kurds are mature enough to see that, I mean, Americans, they can sell anybody, anytime, sell out, which they did. I mean, in Iraq, they did, not once, several times. And here in Syria, at one point, they may say that America still thinks of Turkey as the regional ally, but then the local ally in Syria is the Kurds. So imagine you put yourself into the place of Americans. So your regional and local ally are at war. If you think of, for example, Russians, they have their regional ally, which is Iran, and they have very good relations with Assad, the local ally there, despite the fact that Turkey is a member of the NATO. But the reality on the ground requires them to work with the Kurds.
Because all their own forces had failed.
Yeah, exactly. Because, I mean, first they started working with the Free Syrian army, which was supported by Turkey, but somehow it didn't work. Their priorities changed. Americans no longer were concerned with kind of destroying Assad, but Turkey insisted on that. I mean, if the Americans are now working with the Kurds, it's not America's choice. It is Turkey's kind of failures. One thing why both Europeans and Americans are still somehow supporting Turkey, not Erdogan. I mean, imagine there were 3 million refugees who left Syria, and there was Brexit here, and the political chemistry of European politics changed. So many racist political parties, they became powerful. Imagine if there is more chaos in Turkey and so many people, millions of people, maybe 10 millions of people are pouring into European countries. That will be maybe the end of European Union. So despite the fact that they do have a lot of problems with Erdogan that we know of, but still,
they don't want to destabilize.
They don't want to destabilize Turkey. Not that I think Europeans or the West in general, they like Erdogan. They are very much disappointed at him. But at the same time, he's ruling the country. They have to engage him in one way or another.
If he cannot neutralize or destroy Kurdish autonomy in Syria, what is officially within Syrian borders, he will see this as a defeat, because obviously an autonomous region in Syria offers an example both for the Turkish Kurds and others, but mainly the Turkish Kurds, which are the largest Kurdish community. I mean, people learn through their experiences.
Yeah.
And so the Kurdish people in Turkey naturally will say, we want the same rights. And why not?
We already want it.
Exactly. Yeah. Why not? Yeah. So to resist that is not going to be possible. The only language Erdogan is using at the moment is destroy anything that seems attractive as a model to the Kurds in Turkey. And recently, one of his ministers, I think, said the West shouldn't forget that we placed tens of thousands of troops in Cyprus, even though they didn't want us to. I think they did want them to. Kissinger supported that Turkish move. So this thing they acted against the West is nonsense. They acted with the support of the West. But they're reminding people, we can do these things. We don't care if you don't like it or call us pariahs. But is it going to be that easy? What would be the consequences if Erdogan did go across the Syrian frontier and crush them?
I see. Actually, today we got the news that the Turkish attack on Afrin, the city of Afrin, officially started. There were some airstrikes too. We still don't know whether the Syrian airspace was used or not, whether the Russians gave the permission or not, but probably using the Turkish airspace, but from there attacking some Kurdish positions in Syria. It started. To what extent he can really take this fight? So I think, like Syria is not even Iraq or Egypt or any other country in the Middle East. Syria is, I think, very unique. It was one of the rare places where the Cold War still was continuing, for example. And it's not a coincidence that, I mean, Russians, Americans, Israel, Turkey, Iran, Saudi, every single regional and global force is already involved. Why? Because it may be a bold statement, but I think the political future of Syria would be kind of a summary, a microcosm of the political future of the Middle East, because it is kind of cross-cutting almost every single major problem that have shaped the political kind of map in the Middle East. It is related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Turkish-Kurdish conflict, plus the Shia-Sunni kind of conflict. Pretty much it's at the center of that. So Erdogan may have these ambitions, but then there is Iran, there is, of course, Americans, Russia. Somehow they are trying to kind of reduce his anxiety, maybe giving him even a fake victory so that he can manipulate at home in the run-up to the elections. Americans are not happy with Turkey's aggression. But Erdogan, at home, given the decline of economy, so many problems at home, total instability in every respect, he needs some strong dose of nationalism and maybe some fake victory so that he can use that at home. I think what Erdogan is doing is in vain. He's going to fail and fail so badly, but he's just trying to gain some time until 2019. He is manipulating almost every anti-Kurdish sentiment in order to consolidate the ultra-nationalist social base that he has and his allies. We are in the war against terrorists, enemies. We are all surrounded with external, internal enemies. And the sad thing is, almost always it works. Somehow, people, gather around these, populist, nationalistic demagogues. We will see, but there will be a lot of resistance from the Kurds. There may be another kind of experience like Kobane, what happened in Kobane. The Kurdish people will be resisting Erdogan. And although Erdogan is looking after kind of a victory in Afrin, Afrin may politically turn into his own grave, his cemetery.
The repression against Kurdish cities in Turkey, carried out by Erdogan, the destruction of cities, the destruction of the historic center of Diyarbakir, which I remember visiting some years ago. I mean, this is worse than what was carried out before by previous Turkish governments.
Definitely.
It's much worse. I mean, they did horrific things. We know what they did. Destroyed the ability of the Kurdish people, or tried to speak their own language, tried to destroy their culture, kept them completely marginalized, and insisted that we were all equal citizens of a republic, when in fact, of course, the Kurdish people weren't considered equal. That has now been taken further by Erdogan.
It is a process of what I call a violent recolonization of Kurdish territory. Using tanks and airstrikes to destroy Kurdish towns. I mean, this happens, this is a crime against humanity. You can't do that. You can't use tanks in civilian settlements, particularly in your own country. That is what happened. Like the city of Shirnak, 70% of the city was destroyed. It doesn't exist. All the buildings were bulldozed and destroyed. About 2,000 people were killed, 800 of them were civilians, and now the UN, actually, the rapporteur on human rights, a representative on human rights, they're working on cases. So many atrocities were committed there. So here is, whether President Erdogan alone did that, that is the other strange thing. Those people who destroyed all of those towns, many of them are in prison now, actually, because they were also a part of
the coup.
Yeah. Those who destroyed, in particular, Sur, Jizre, and Nusaybin, the most destruction happened in these three towns. All of them are in prison now.
But the other aspect of this is all what you described, the destruction of these cities, the death of civilians, torture, rape. This was happening to a country not so far from Europe. And by and large, the European Union leaders remained silent. There was no big assault, even verbally, from the European Union leadership on this repression.
Honestly, I have had a lot of debates with them, and they always say we are concerned about the developments in Turkey. So, and in Twitter I read a line by some guy who wrote, "I am concerned about the concerns of European Union when bad things happen in Turkey." Right? So the European Union doesn't have a policy on Turkey and the Kurds. And there are 28 member states and they don't agree on any single point. That's their problem.
Let's be serious about the European Union. When we talk about the European Union, it's not the tiny state, it's the Germans, the French and the British, and behind them the United States.
Yeah, I think two things. I mean, the so-called refugee crisis was a huge thing for Europeans. They were scared of Erdogan threatening to ship all of them to Europe. They were really scared. Yes, they bribed him. They gave all the money, please keep your refugees there. But definitely you are right. I mean, there was no strong reaction to a candidate country which is trying to be a member of the European Union, destroying all those Kurdish towns, committing crimes against humanity. Europeans mostly, unfortunately, they remain silent. Not that they approved it, but when we talk to them, many of them, yeah, we see that. We understand Erdogan is a monster. In fact, many European politicians, high-ranking bureaucrats I talked to, they likened Erdogan to Hitler of 1930s. They would give me examples, like he is doing that exactly Hitler did that in 1930s. Not that they don't know about it.
They know about it.
They know about it. This is cynicism. The problem is that they are doing it despite the fact that they know about it. Mostly saying that we have refugee crisis, we have migration issues, we have economic interests, we have this. I mean, the discourse of democracy and human rights in Europe is totally bankrupt, totally corrupt.
Tell me something in conclusion. From what we've been discussing, you seem quite optimistic that Erdogan can't carry on indefinitely, that sooner or later, so you are optimistic on that level.
I think we are going to survive Erdogan. We are a people. He is a person. People always survive persons, even if they can be very, very strong. That is one thing. Second, Erdogan is not able to stabilize the country politically, economically, socially. But for 10 years, from 2002 up until 2011 and 12, Erdogan stabilized the country. Living standards somehow increased, all right?
So did corruption, by the way.
Of course. I mean, they go together.
And
they go together.
Himself, his family,
exactly.
His associates grew very rich.
Exactly. But Erdogan created a society that is demanding more and more, really. But he's not able to satisfy their demands. I think that is the major challenge, because middle classes, all the liberal people, even left-leaning people, you would remember in 2007, 8, 9, people were supporting Erdogan. He was the good guy who was trying to defeat the authoritarian state. And, you know, many liberals, leftists, Kurds, all of them, they were supportive of Erdogan. Yes, Erdogan created
an illusion.
He created an illusion, but he really killed the father, the sovereign, the old state, as the elder brother who was delivering justice, right? We like elder brothers, but we never like angry fathers, because people don't want polarization. They want a stable economy. They want to see what's going to happen in the coming few months. Honestly, now, nobody knows what's going to happen in Turkey next week, including the AKP people who are in power now. So that is why I think people are overwhelmed, they're exhausted. Internationally, he's isolated, we know. Although, like, still, I mean, he's getting some support from here and there. But I remember, like, 10 years ago, Erdogan, as you said in your introduction,
worshipped.
He was worshipped in Europe, in the US. Nobody could even criticize him. And also the fact that there is no alternative to him politically. We just need to somehow come together and try to imagine and implement an alternative to Erdogan. I think we will survive him. I'm optimistic.
Hisyar Özsoy, thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.